All right. Is this working? Can you hear me? All right. How are we doing today? That's not good enough. Okay, how are we doing? Still not good enough. This is not a Postgres conference. So, how are we doing? Thank you. Okay, let me get my notes, carefully scribbled with a pen. Legacy writing device. Okay, so, let's get started. So, who am I? It's good to meet you all. Thank you for welcoming me to this wonderful stage. My name's Jono Baker, and I work at Canonical as the Ubuntu Community Manager. And my job is to grow and enthuse and build a kind of a structured community in the global Ubuntu community. I started there about 3.5 years ago. Started out as just me reporting to Mark Shuttleworth, and now my team's grown and the community's grown. It's a really fun place to work. So Ubuntu is my primary occupation, but as was mentioned just a second ago, I also wrote this book called The Art of Community. It was interesting because my best friend was actually giving me pretty much daily grief every day, saying, you need to write this stuff down. Because community is this kind of bizarre kind of black art. A lot of people have picked it up over the years. But writing a book was actually a really hard prospect because structuring how these topics fit together was kind of difficult. So I almost turned to heroin in writing that book. It was a pretty unpleasant experience. And then finally, there's the Community Leadership Summit. So I was going to conferences kind of like this and seeing lots of people getting up and waving their hands around about community and all the rest of it. And people were talking about products. Like I was talking about Ubuntu, Carson was talking about Fedora. Various people were talking about various topics. But no one was talking about the best practice involved in how you build a community. No one was talking about the skills. And nobody, and I mean nobody, gets a monopoly on building a great community. Everybody has a right to a great community. So I set up the Community Leadership Summit as a unconference in which people can get together and share ideas. And the very ethos of that conference is no vendors, right? This is not, no one talks about MySQL, no one talks about Ubuntu. Everyone talks about building great communities, about governance, about conflict resolution, those kinds of things. So we did it for the first time last year. It was really successful, and we're going to be doing it again. It's the weekend before OSCON. It's another great O'Reilly conference. So if you're going to OSCON, do pop along. All right. So we're here to talk about this word. How many people here would say they're in a community? Okay. You all should put your hands up, because the fact that you're here today puts you in a community. Community is an interesting word in the sense that it's been heavily butchered by the IT industry. The reason is because it's an implicitly nice word. I mean, there's no bad kind of association with the word community. Marketing people tend to like it. Community is very warm and fuzzy, you know? And this word has been kind of thrown around all over the place, and we've seen some very successful communities. We've seen people like Facebook and Twitter. There's obviously the Twitter Developer Conference going on right now. Wikipedia. Wikipedia is interesting because when I was about 6 years old, I asked my mum and dad for a dictionary for Christmas so I could look rude words up in it. And kids do that on Wikipedia now. It's like a much more granular and collaborative way of defining the most horrible sexual terms in the world. Allegedly. But fundamentally, all of these are communities, right? They're people who get together to work on something on a shared ethos. And in the IT industry, we've known about communities for years. I mean, the minute as soon as patch and diff were invented, people started collaborating on software. But people tended to, in general in the IT industry, tended to just leave communities to their own devices. And then organizations started realizing that if you actually harness and invest in a community, you can actually get a lot of software development done. You can actually get some really good interaction with the people who are using your software. So we then saw the concept of the community manager. And this is like the hot new topic, which is really interesting because community managers are the most uncool people in the world. Like, I'm not joking. Like, people think that it's all about, it's all about traveling around the world and doing presentations. It's not. It's not. It's about dealing with irritating people on the internet for a reasonable degree of the time. So we've seen this term bandied around, and this begged a big question, like, what does it actually mean to build a community? What does it actually mean to grow a community that's successful, that's interested in the work that you're doing? Unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, their views of community, particularly business, particularly the executive level in an organization, they have their own view of what community means. It's this. This is a guy called Tron Guy. I can't tell how he got the name. I actually met him for the first time at this. It was an interesting conference. It was a combination of an open source conference and a science fiction convention. Yeah, imagine the people that attended that one. And well, here's an example of it. So Tron Guy, you know, it's a great show. Lots of fun. People walking around in Klingon outfits, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of kind of executives think that the community is this kind of group of pasty white kind of creeping individuals who live in their mother's basements with like Buffy the Vampire Slayer cardboard cutouts surrounding them. That's about 20% true. But most of it's not. That's obviously not the case. So when people started, when these organizations started seeing real value coming out of communities, they were like, okay, how do we divide this up in our organization? And this then kicked off a next debate, which was, if you have a community manager, if you have somebody who's growing your community, such as the MySQL community, does that person sit in marketing or does that person sit in engineering? And this has actually been quite a debate because there's two types of community managers. You've got community managers who go around waving their hands around and talking about what is going on with their communities. And they're what I refer to as evangelists. They're valuable people in an organization, but they don't really grow and manage a community. They just go around enthusing people about what's going on in that community. And then you get people who essentially manage engineering. And they're engineering managers, but the people who work for them are essentially volunteers. So we see these different types of roles in terms of how people grow a subset of the community. Like marketing is often more focused towards end users. So marketing community managers and evangelists tend to go around whipping people up and getting them excited about the concept of what they're doing. Engineering community managers tend to work on collaboration. So they're interested in tooling and infrastructure and processes that help build software more effectively. So when we started seeing the development of the community manager, and we started seeing these different types of roles being defined, most businesses said, all right, what's the business value? Fundamentally, if you're going to invest in something, you have to ask this question, what's the business value? Now, I'm not interested in talking today about what is involved in hiring a community manager. What I'm interested in talking about is how people can grow communities in this room. So everybody in this room is involved in the community, and some people in this room are leaders in that community. Some people in this room enthuse and inspire people to join the MySQL community and sub-communities within it. So these business values that I'm about to talk about, while they apply to a community manager who's hired by a company, they actually apply to leaders in a community, volunteer leaders as well. The first thing, if you think about a community in a structured way and you grow it and you inspire a community and you have a sense of leadership, is you build positive mindshare. Now, mindshare is more important than users. Everyone talks about, for example, the Linux desktop. How many people are using the Linux desktop? Is this the year of the Linux desktop? I remember people saying that back in 1998. I mean, 1998, if that's the year of the Linux desktop, then the caveman times was the year of the skyscraper. But when you have mindshare, the perception of your community is bigger than it actually is. And that gets people involved. And that helps you actually grow closer towards, achieving that level of size and growth that you want. So mindshare is tremendously important. This is where evangelists are actually quite important. They go around, while they go around to conferences and they wave their hands around and they have handshaky lunches with people, they grow mindshare and awareness of what's going on in that community. The next thing is, if you have somebody who's leading a community, you want them to be contextually capable. And what I mean by this is, if you take a marketing kind of community manager, so somebody who is great with user communities, and again, these people are often volunteers. If you have that person try and grow and manage an engineering community, it will be unparalleled fail. Like the finest level of fail the world has ever seen. Like Simon Cowell kind of level of fail is what I'm talking about. I think we're all on the same page now. So But if you, in the flip side, if you take somebody who's really, really great at inspiring and enthusing engineers, you know, so figuring out how engineers tick, what workflow is involved, how to define work items, how to manage bugs and things like that, and you have them try and grow a user community, it will be an equal level of fail. Kind of Paula Abdul level of fail, which I think still on the same page. So you want people in your community, your leaders in your community, to be really well-versed in what they're actually doing. Unfortunately, we often get people who are very excitable and say the word awesome every 2 minutes, which I know I'm guilty of at times. And these people tend to go out there and say, yeah, we're going to whip up some excitement, but when they get the excitement and people are involved, it's difficult to try and channel that energy in a way that's effective and productive and fun. So it's like any job, you know, find the right people for the right kind of job. And then the final thing is the ability to do stuff. Like communities, while they're an interesting combination, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this in the sense that when you join a community, it's a phenomenally creative environment. It's very, very susceptible to ideas. Like people sit down and their creativity is unleashed. I remember a guy probably about 6 or 8 months ago emailed me. One thing I've been trying to grow in the Ubuntu community is the concept of opportunistic development. That is really scratching your own itch. The fact that if you want to write software, you don't have to be a systematic programmer. And he emailed me and he said, you know, I've been working in this like large enterprise as a Java developer. And I've been kind of looking at myself in the mirror every morning and thinking, why on earth am I doing this? And he said, and then I joined the open source community, and I realized I have the skills to make software, and I can make any software I want. And he said, I felt incredibly liberated. And that's a wonderful attribute in communities, and we harness that all the time. However, communities can often become these glacial kind of bureaucratic entities. A lot of communities will start out and they'll say, for us to be a proper community, we need to have a governance council. And so they have a codified governance agreement, and they have a board, and they have a code of conduct, and all of these different elements. And it's just meaningless bullshit in the way of getting stuff done. And we want to stay well clear of that. We want to provide an environment that's nimble and agile to making things happen. So you want somebody who's going to be leading your community who's going to really get stuff done. Somebody who's going to say, you know what? We're going to make things happen. We're not going to get wrapped up in software selections. We're not going to get wrapped up in bureaucracy and governance. We're going to be practical and make things happen. Because the biggest enemy to community is when somebody joins a community and they feel like nothing happens. Because fundamentally, these people are volunteers. And if you're a volunteer and you join, let's say, the MySQL community, and nothing's happening, and you think, I could either spend my time with this group of people who are arguing about things that I don't care about and getting nothing done, or I could watch Lost. What's it going to be? So we want to provide that kind of nimble environment. So there's basically 2 types of community out there. 2 very distinctive types. We have read communities and write communities. So read communities are basically people like this. Trekkies. These are people who tend to consume a shared interest. So Star Trek fans are really into Star Trek, obviously, because they're Star Trek fans. That's a quote for the day. And Star Trek fans, fundamentally, they watch the show, they read the books, they play the games, but they don't generally contribute to the actual thing that they consume. They just tend to get together and they talk about it and they theorize about it and they make all of these wonderful outfits and stuff like that. But they don't actually adjust the thing that they consume. So they're very much read communities. They're very much user communities. They're the kind of people who consume books and music and movies and all that kind of stuff. And these communities are actually fairly easy to set up because you just essentially need to provide communication channels. These communities don't really require any kind of collaborative infrastructure. You just need to provide a means in which they can connect to each other and share their interest. So we have these kinds of communities as read communities, and for most of the people in this room, you're probably not interested in this because we're software people. Whereas the next type of community is write. And a good example of that is Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is well, let me ask the question first of all. How many people here are using Ubuntu? Wow, more than I expected. You are good people. Actually, could everyone who's using Ubuntu stand up, please? Just for a second. Just for a second. Okay. Everyone who's sat down, clap them. Thank you. Okay. You all deserve that. So Ubuntu is a very large community. I mean, it's a very large global community. It's very difficult to try and communicate the context of a community because it's such a complicated beast. So statistics are always a good idea. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk through some. Don't you just love that? I'm going to talk through a couple of Ubuntu statistics. I mean, you know, the whole statistics are meaningless. Well, they are, but I like them. So as an example, we've got about 300 developers around the world. These are core approved developers. We have local user groups, over 220 of them around the world. We have over 1 million people who are registered in our forums. The forums are huge. When we release a version of Ubuntu, and we're releasing a new version of Ubuntu in about 15 days, we have generally about 68,000 concurrent users on the forums. It's pretty large. We have a Facebook group. That's an old figure. It's actually more like 140,000 now. Ubuntu is very well translated. We have this ethos that you should have your software in your language. And so we have over 70 translations. We have a wide variety of teams who work on different things, translations, documentation, all that kind of stuff. So over 330 of those. We have over 35,000 wiki pages. And usage is very difficult because, you know, I could give one person in this audience an Ubuntu CD, and they could give it to 1,000 of their friends, and we'd never know. So it's very difficult to actually gauge how many users we've got. But the hand-wavy figure is about 12 million plus. So in trying to figure out how we build this kind of community, typically what we do is we tend to talk about topics like this. So the book that I wrote, The Art of Community, really delves into each of these sort of things. You know, how do we define growth? How do we measure how our community grows? Because if you can't measure it, then you can't really see it. How do we report back to the community on progress being made? How do we deal with essentially arseholes on the internet? Conflict resolution. How do we build efficiency? I mean, community, again, the enemy of community is bureaucracy. How do we build buzz and excitement? How do we strategize, build transparency, processes, governance, conduct events? So when we try and tease apart all of these different things, it becomes a very complicated science. And again, if you're interested in reading about this kind of stuff, then I recommend you take a look at the book. But I want to boil this down for a second. And this quote is one that has always lived with me. This guy called Peter Block. His expertise really lives in the area of kind of industrial design, urban regeneration, that kind of stuff. But he said community is fundamentally an interdependent human system given form by the conversation it holds with itself. What he's essentially saying here is that the way we build awareness and growth and expertise in communities through stories. I mean, I've been here, I sat on the freeway for about 2 hours this morning talking to myself and shouting at the car seat. But since I've been here already, I've only been here for 20 minutes. I've already heard 4 or 5 people tell me stories. They've said, you know, this is going on with the conference, this is going on with MySQL. And in each story that's shared with me, there's an underlying truth. There's an ethic that they're trying to communicate. So the story is a means of sharing best practice, and there's an underlying kind of concept in that vessel. So Peter Block really identified this, and I think this is a really interesting idea, is that when we encourage the ability to spread stories, communities grow. And when we do that, what happens is we start seeing different pockets of community growing in different areas. So at that point, we need to build effective teams. If you have, for example, a team of documentation writers, and you have a team of software engineers, and you have a team of translators, each of those teams is a little vessel that does something specifically and should fit in with the rest of the community. So teams become very, very important aspects of community. And the reason for this is scope. So as some of you may have noticed, I'm English. I know that half the audience is surprised now that I'm not Australian. But I'm English. I'm an Englishman living in America. And when I first moved over here to live with my wife, I didn't know anyone. I mean, I knew people on the internet. And but I didn't know anyone in my local area. And California felt massive to me. It felt huge because I didn't really know. I didn't know where my pharmacy is. I didn't know where my In-N-Out burger is. I didn't know where the schools are, where the freeway is. I don't know how the streets are lined up. And I was kind of, I was exacerbated by the size of the area that I lived in. And then I started getting to know people in my very local area. I started to get to know the woman who owns the coffee shop over the road and the guy who owns the pizza shop down the road. And I started getting to know the pharmacy guy when I go to pick up medicine. And now the area started feeling more personable. It started feeling more accessible to me. And the reason for that is that when you feel like you know the scope of an area, when you feel like you can see the borders, you feel comfortable, right? And this is why teams are so important, is that, for example, if you're going to join the Ubuntu community, we've got thousands of people in the Ubuntu community, active contributors. For one person to join those thousands of people, it can feel like a hugely overpowering environment. Whereas if that one person joins a small team, they get to know the team and then they feel like they have a place in that huge environment. So that's the reason why I think teams are so important, is that they offer a sense of scope, and scope generates a sense of belonging. And belonging is really the heart of what we do in the community, is when, if you want someone to join a community and you want them to stay, you want them to feel like they belong. You want them to feel like they join a community, they do good work, and the community values their interactions. If they don't feel a sense of belonging, the opportunity for being distracted by Lost is tremendous. Lost is the enemy of community, by the way. You may have picked this up. Mainly because I've been staying awake until 3 o'clock in the morning for the last couple of weeks watching it. So teams are very, 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 very important vessels. And they're important for the scope. They're important to build belonging. They're important because people can share stories in those teams. They're also important because they're great methods of sharing experience. So if you have a documentation team, the kind of people who are attracted to that team are the kind of people who are generally interested in documentation, and therefore they will share skills about building great documentation. If you have one person who's interested in documentation and they will walk into a room of 100,000 people and they said, I like documentation, it's going to be very difficult to find the other people who like documentation. So this is part of the reason why we structure it this way. The other thing about teams, which I think is really important, is they define a sense of purpose. So the reason why volunteers join communities is not because they want to help Oracle. The reason why people are interested in MySQL is not because they want Oracle to be a more successful company or to contribute to the Oracle donkey sanctuary. The reason why people join communities is because they believe in making great software that everybody has access to. When we start compromising on the ethic that people contribute their time, their gifts, to a resource that we can all share, when we compromise that, we start to lose community. Conversely, when people join a community and and that ethos is there and present, they feel a sense of purpose. They feel like they get up in the morning and they do things that help people. It's like an ethical mission. I'm sure all of you have felt this in the past. I'm sure that when you fire up MySQL, you think to yourself, I'm doing the right thing because MySQL is a good piece of open source software. It feels nice and warm and fuzzy. And we like nice, warm, fuzzy databases. So we need to really cultivate and develop this sense of purpose. And the idea that, even MySQL as one such project is this very large piece of software with lots of different diverse skills involved in building it. And everybody should feel like they're putting one brick in the wall. Everybody should feel like when they contribute, they put their one brick in, which by itself is pretty useless, but when it's combined with all the other bricks, is just a phenomenal creation. So teams are a great way of encompassing that kind of ethos. And that's another tremendous reason why we set them up. So what I'm harking towards, or what I like to refer to as the mechanics of community. These are the underlying theories and attributes that we need to engage in to build a great community. So if you're interested in growing a community, whether it's in here or it's a part of the MySQL community or elsewhere, I think this will be of particular interest that might be useful. So I'm going to talk through them first of all. There's 4 mechanics of community. The first thing is communication. A community that doesn't have simple, easy, and effective communication channels, it just doesn't happen. The love just does not exist. Communication is a complex topic because different people's brains are wired up different ways, and they naturally gravitate to different things. In the same way that I'm sure you've all realized that Perl people are very different to Python people. Perl people tend to go around killing people. Python people tend to go around saving people. I'm not biased in any way. So, you know, in the same way that you have the deviant angel kind of divide between Perl and Python people, people are naturally aligned towards different methods of communication. Like developers hate forums in general, but developers love mailing lists because developers like content to come to them. Developers are the bastions of efficiency. So they like content to come to them. They don't have to go somewhere else and find content. For example, developers like IRC, because IRC is text, and text is a low bandwidth environment where they can be hacking on stuff and have a conversation going on in the background. You've probably noticed this, that developers get very, very itchy feet when on conference calls. For that very reason, because a conference call feels like an hour of wasted time when you could be doing something more interesting like writing software. So we need to figure out the right communication channels for the right kind of brains. The next thing is structure. I mentioned these teams. We can have documentation, translations, teams, all these different types of teams. And we want to structure those teams individually, but then we want them to fit into the wider environment. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. The next thing is collaboration. If you want to make something, we're talking about write communities. We're not talking about read communities. So if you want to create something, which is what a write community does, you need tools. And you need the right kind of tools for the right kind of job. You know, if you go up to a developer and say, you know what, I'd like to write code using Edlin, they're pretty much going to punch you in the face. In the same way that if you go up to certain developers and say to them, I'd like you to write your code in Eclipse, they're probably also going to punch you in the face. There's a balance. There's a balance to finding the right kind of people with the right kind of perspectives and how they work, understanding their workflow, understanding the way they're wired up, and picking the right tools for the job. This is actually a really complicated topic, collaborative development. And then the final thing is environment. We have these little teams, and teams knit together in this jigsaw puzzle of a wider community, and they communicate in the teams, but they also communicate with the wider community as well. So we want to build an environment in which the teams are not only fitting together, but they can communicate and collaborate between themselves as well. If we miss off the 4th point and we just build great teams that collaborate well and they have great structure and great communication, what we essentially do is we create a network of fiefdoms. And we don't want to, fiefdoms are bad. Like teams that don't work with other teams, these little silos are not good. So, mandatory A-team reference. I actually do love it when a plan comes together. What I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to go through each of these 4 mechanics and talk about how you typically will build a community and some of the elements that are involved. So again, if you're a community lead, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I think this will be of reasonable interest to you. So communities, their fundamental raw material are people. People with opinions. So we have these 3 little people. I'm very tempted to name them, but I'm going to offend somebody if I name them, no matter what names I pick. So we'll just refer to them as the 3 people. The first thing we need to do is to have them communicate between themselves. So let me ask you a question. How many people in this room are really interested in quality assurance? Okay. So a subset of the room put their hands up, and you folks, put your hands up again. Right, now look at each other, right? And remember each other's faces, because we're creating a community right now. So you people should communicate with each other, because when you know each other and you identify that you share this interest, then you can make interesting things happen, right? So we first of all identify people who've got a shared interest, and we've opened up the communication. Now that can be stood in a room talking to each other, that could be something else. The next thing we need to do is to help them become a team. And a lot of this is about really producing identity in a team. So you want to make sure that they feel pride. As an example, I have a team at Canonical, and we manage the community. And I've got 3 people who work for me, just about to hire a 4th. And we're known in the company, in the community, as the 4 Horsemen, mainly because 2 of us are huge Metallica fans. And we have this sense of team spirit, so I make the team T-shirts with little horses on and stuff like that. It makes everybody feel like a united unit, like a strong, cohesive unit. So we need to build this sense of team culture and pride with the QA team. Then collaboration. So collaboration using the QA as an example. At this point, you're going to want to figure out how do you collaborate around unit tests? How do you do automated tests? How do you do smoke testing? How do you manage bugs and handle triage? How do you link bugs in MySQL in a distribution to upstream MySQL? So we figure out these different collaborative elements of how the team works, of how the team does QA, and we make sure we have the tools in place, the tools that make sense for everybody. Okay. So at this point, when we do this successfully for each team, we start figuring out, this starts happening for multiple teams. Because what we do as a community leader is we build out this best practice. So what we do is each little unit here, we document how you set up the communication, how you set up the structure, and how you set up effective collaboration. And then you'll find teams in your community naturally setting themselves up. At this point, again, if we leave it like this, we then create fiefdoms. We don't want each of these teams to become a silo, because when they're a silo, what happens is if they get a little bit kind of angsty, if they get a little bit kind of anxious about what's going on, if they're not very happy, then discontent can spread, and they turn into little septic kind of tanks. Probably a better way of describing it than septic tanks. So we have these 4 teams, and then these 5 teams, and what we want to do is we want to build an environment around them. Want each team to feel like a really important unit. This is possibly the most important thing a community leader can do, because the community leader is a shared currency between all of the teams in their community. So a community leader needs to go to each of these teams, be known, and express that their work is really important and it's valued, and they play a very important part in the ecosystem. Part of the way you do this is through making them communicate. So as an example, recently in the Ubuntu community, we have a documentation team, and then we have a new project that's opened up called the Ubuntu Learning Project, where people are producing learning materials for teaching people how to use Ubuntu. And then we have another project called the Ubuntu Manual Project, where a set of volunteers have written a book in their spare time. We have now 3 teams that are fundamentally based around building documentation and content. And they were acting relatively independently. So my job now is to help those 3 teams to work effectively together, so they can divide and conquer. Okay, so communication, structure, collaboration, environment. This is the way you build your community. These approaches can apply to any community. It can apply to the MySQL community, and it can apply to a local coffee shop. Fundamentally, it's helping people talk to each other, making them feel like a team, making sure they have the tools to do their work, and making them feel part of the wider environment. In a community, you want to build a sense of ubiquity around this kind of best practice. So if you have one team that is really well structured, has great communication, great collaborative tools, but the rest of the community doesn't really care, you're not going to make a huge amount of progress. You need to build a sense of we want to be productive and proactive and efficient in our community. You need to build an ubiquity around the concept of efficiency, and also that the community is fun. Because if we become a little bit too project managery, communities stop becoming very fun and start becoming too much like hard work. The interesting thing about ubiquity is community leaders have nothing to do with it. This is a quote. I don't even know where this quote came from. I found it on the internet. And it basically says, a shift in thinking and actions of citizens is more vital than a shift of thinking and actions of institutions and formal leaders. So what this is basically saying is, you can put as much best practice and guidance and documentation and infrastructure in place as you want, but fundamentally, if the people in your community are not interested, then it doesn't matter. In the same way that politicians in Washington or London or wherever else, they can make as many decisions as they want about how our country works. But if the people don't respect and understand that decision, then chaos ensues. And we've seen this in various scenarios around the world where someone passes a rule or a legislation or a law, and then they kind of backtrack it because there's just huge dissent. So we need to build. This is not about, it's kind of like a classic management philosophy, When you start out as a manager, I was the same when I started out. When you start out, you think, I've got people who work for me, and the way this works is that I do the thinking and they do the doing. I'm going to tell them what to do, and they can lump it. And then you realize that that doesn't create a huge amount of camaraderie in your team. So you start thinking, okay, instead of telling them what to do, I'm going to inspire them around solving the problem. So I don't see my team as an example. I don't see them as my subordinates. I see them as my colleagues. And my job is to get them excited and motivated about the problems that we're there to solve and to help them feel like they have a real sense of control in the team. In the same way that if you tell your community how they're going to work, they're going to get pretty angry. So you need to kind of inspire and enthuse this sense of this is how we're going to do things because this is probably the best way of doing it. So, just a few tips as I bring this into the finish line around good ways for community leaders to work. And this applies to community managers as well. So if you're a community manager, or if you are a manager who is interested in hiring a community manager, there's a parallel to each of these different terms, each of these different slides. So the first thing is community leaders will not do very well unless they actually have some kind of people management skills. The perception about 4 years ago was that to be a good community leader, you had to be loud, and you had to have a great blog. Now the perception in some parts of the industry is that if you have a lot of Twitter followers, and you have a loud blog, and you have a loud voice, and you say the word awesome every 2 seconds, then you're a good community leader. That's an evangelist. Evangelists are very good at making noise and getting people pumped up. Like when, essentially cheerleaders is what a lot of evangelists are. And that's a really valuable tool, but that's not somebody who can help communities around workflow and around growth. So you want your community leaders to be people who really understand how technical infrastructure and workflow works in an engineering capacity and how people tick and how people think in a kind of an end user capacity. That's really important. The second thing is, and this is particularly important if you are hiring a community manager, is don't over-travel. I made this mistake when I joined Canonical. So I joined Canonical and I just jaunted all over the world. I was going from conference to conference to conference. This was wrong for a few reasons. First of all, it was wrong for my personal life because I was traveling so much and my girlfriend was angry. And it was, I was getting stressed out. I was sick of airports. I was tired of eating restaurants. The only thing that was great was that I didn't have to do any washing up. But it was fun to, but my perspective was, I've got this new job. This is a great opportunity, a great excuse for me to travel and see the world on somebody else's dime. And that's basically what people think when they join. The problem is that when you're traveling and you're at conferences, like today's a good example. I'm speaking here, and then I'm going to the Linux Collaboration Summit in San Francisco, and then I'm going to Napa to another conference. And so today is basically entirely sucked up with talking to people in the real world. No email's going to get done. I'm not going to talk to my community on the internet. I'm talking to people who are generally not in the community. So it's actually a disservice to the community in many ways. So, being away means that you're not with your community. And I think it's a very important consideration to make. Don't over-travel. The other thing that's really important for community leaders and for formalized community managers and for anybody is to define growth opportunities. Like when you have a community, when you have a group of people who are inspired around a particular thing, is to really understand how you can grow that community. Everyone likes to feel a sense of momentum. Whether you're in an organization, you start out as a junior programmer, and then you develop to a senior programmer, and then you maybe turn into a CTO or whatever else. People like that, and people also like that in communities. They feel like they want to keep on moving. And a significant reason why a lot of people join communities is to basically build their reputation as good people in that community. That's the reason why they're meritocracies, is that People love the concept of merit. So identify your really, really good people in your community and help them to grow. Like, this is something I do all the time, is that someone will join. A good example is the guy who's running the Ubuntu Manual project is this guy called Benjamin Humphreys. He joined the Ubuntu community. He's incredibly loud. He stepped on a few toes when he joined. But his sheer enthusiasm and willingness to progress was a real trait of somebody who's good at what they do. But we need to take that raw material and kind of refine it into a slightly more effective, like literally like a more refined kind of machine. So identifying those people and helping them to grow is a really good thing to do as well. And then the final thing is focus on practical goals. One of the things that agitates me a little bit about open source is that there's so much ethereal and theoretical talking going on. You know, you get some people who really focus on very practical things like bugs and tools and you know, unit testing and documentation, all these different things. And then you get people who just walk around and they talk about kind of very hand-wavy, socially type nonsense. Now, I'm guilty of this. I've talked about social capital and gift culture and all that kind of stuff. But when you're in a community and you want to grow your teams to do really interesting work, define practical things that they can do. So as an example, in the Ubuntu community, each cycle that we have lasts 6 months. And at the beginning of each cycle, I encourage all of our different teams to think about what they want to do in the next cycle. So say, okay, first of all, what problems do you want to solve? What opportunities do you want to chase? And then when you have an idea of that, have some ideas generation. And then for each of the ideas that you want to work on, document it, write specifications, have a roadmap, assign actions. Because when you have this plan in place, it makes the community feel more proactive, and it helps people know what they're working on. The other benefit of that is that another attribute to communities is that people will join up and they'll be like, yeah, we've got all these great ideas. This is a cool thing we can work on. And you'll say, well, okay, are you happy to work in this project? And they say, yeah, I'll do that. And you say, well, what about this one? Or, yeah, I'll do that as well. And people overcommit, and then nothing gets done. A common element in project management theory is that if you have a shared document that everyone can view, such as a public specification about a project, and you have a series of actions, and you've got assignments to people on those actions, and it's a public document, and those people have committed publicly to something, it's a lot more likely they're going to do it. So this is a good way of making people feel a sense of accountability for the work and the contributions that they're making. So I've got 3 minutes and 17 seconds left. I'm going to wrap it up. Again, the book is available in all good bookshops. I was going to bring a couple of copies along, but I completely forgot because I'm incompetent. If you are too cheap to buy the book, it's also available online. You can. When we started working on the book, I was really keen to make sure that everyone has access to the information. So if you go to www.artofcommunityonline.org, you can download the book as a PDF for free there. Alternatively, you can go and buy it and show O'Reilly that publishing Creative Commons books is a really good idea. And I'm done. So any questions before I finish up? No? Completely clear. Huh? I think you might need to come to the mic. Or shout really loud. Are you like glued to the floor or something? Okay. Instances of what, sorry? Oh, grouping. Oh, groupthink. Okay. So how are you talking about how people think together on and solving problems, that kind of thing? Sorry, I can't hear you very well. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear your question. I'm happy to answer it if you walk up to the mic, but anything else? No? Oh, we're getting a mic. Yeah. Yeah, could you repeat your question to us through the mic? The anticipation is palpable.
Well, there is a psychological phenomenon that is sometimes observed in geographically distributed teams situations, which is called groupthink. And you can look it up on Wikipedia, what it means. But I'm just curious how community leaders deal with issues like that.
I have to say, I've never heard of the term groupthink. Can you describe what it is?
Well, I'm not a specialist, but you could look at it. It's basically when people have strong opinions and the strength of opinions overwhelms the common sense.
Oh,
when
I see.
An outsider comes in with some other
Right.
suggestions.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. So you're talking about opinionated people on the internet. Okay. I've heard a rumor that there's opinionated people on the internet. I think the key thing here is that there's always tremendous opinion, and there's always tremendous opinion about every decision that's made in an open source community. And the reason for that is that we're so familiar with the concept of openness and collaboration in open source that some people have the misconception that if you have an opinion, you get a right to a say, and your say gets listened to. And that's simply not the case in most communities. This is something I think we need to educate wider in open source, is that fundamentally, if you have an opinion and you do something with your opinion, if you have a proactive impact on doing something, then people listen to you. But there is this huge misconception that people will think, okay, I think this is a terrible decision about something, and if their decision is not listened to, then they get even more agitated. So I think the way we do this is clarify. Like very recently, some of you may have seen the news, Mark Shuttleworth clarified that Ubuntu is not a democracy. It's a meritocracy. And there was this huge kind of massive surprise about this, which it kind of took me by surprise, because I've been banging this drum for the last 3.5 years that Ubuntu is not a democracy. And it isn't. But the reason why that is because most of us live in countries that are democratically run, so therefore we associate good citizenship, as in, our countries are generally fairly, have a good sense of law and order. So we associate that with democracy. So democracy is the most natural way to organize people, whereas in reality, it doesn't work in a collaborative environment such as open source. But that's the reason why I think a lot of people assume that. So the way we do that is I think we clarify that we are meritocracies, and you bring merit, you bring value, and we push it forward. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a good day.